je vous ai présenté à nos spectateurs, Kevin, donc vous vous connaissez, je pense que c'est pas très utile que je répète, mais en revanche nous allons passer tout de suite aux questions qui s'articulent en 4 points. Votre œuvre en général, de point de vue littéraire, les personnages, votre façon de vous brancher avec votre imaginaire, votre travail dans les licences Star Wars, Star Trek et Blade Runner, évidemment, passage obligé, le steampunk, et ensuite, comment dire, Dr Adair, la vie, l'univers, le futur et le reste. Et ce sera la fin de notre interview à ce moment-là. Alors, vous avez très souvent utilisé la ville des anges comme décor dans votre œuvre, au point d'en faire pour moi, lectrice, un personnage à part entière, mais de votre côté, celui de l'écrivain, quelle place lui accordez-vous dans votre imaginaire? Est-ce que l'influence du noir et du hard-boiled y est pour quelque chose?
Yeah, that's a pretty valid observation. The city of Los Angeles has always been sort of the dream city, the city of my deep consciousness. Are we good? Yes? Because I grew up not in Los Angeles, but outside of it. Are we good? Okay. And so Los Angeles was always this sort of city of longing for me, and a city that I knew something about, but did not know it as deeply as I wanted to. So as I grew older and as I imagined and thought about Los Angeles, it became, you know, sort of my emerald city, my city of longing, my city of imagination. And at the same time, I had sort of a historical background to Los Angeles because of my family, before I was born, coming to the area as sort of economic migrants from other parts of the United States. And so it was always this sort of dream landscape for me. And you see that, I think, in my books, where in something like my horror novel, In the Land of the Dead, it goes very far back, relatively, in the history of Los Angeles. It goes back to the Great Depression. And then we go all the way forward to books of mine like Madlands, where it depicts and imagines a future imaginary Los Angeles. So in some ways, yeah, that was to think of the city of Los Angeles as a character, even if it's not speaking the way a character does or walking around the way a character does. It's always that constant influence, like the weather or just the way people think about things.
Et si on établit un parallèle avec vos personnages, pardon, et si on établit un parallèle avec vos personnages en quête ou en refus du père, je vais recommencer parce que je pense que Kevin n'a pas entendu. Et si on établit un parallèle avec vos personnages en quête ou en refus du père, Los Angeles serait-elle la mer dévorante cachée? Et par une extension tout à fait équilibriste de ma part, sachant que votre toute dernière série de romans met une héroïne en scène, la série Kim Ho, quelle est la place que vous accordez aux femmes en général dans votre œuvre? Ça fait 2 questions en une.
Yeah, the notion of the landscape that people move through and how that influences the characters. I think with some of what I've been doing just recently with what I call the Kim O thrillers, it's really the first time that I've dealt with a female protagonist and also dealt with a female protagonist in the first person. And it's one of those experiences that on the surface seems quite odd. There's tremendous differences between me and this character, Kim O. She's female, she's much younger than I am, comes from a different cultural background, and on the surface, she's Korean American. But she sees herself not as Korean American, but what she talks about as feral American, in the sense that because of being an orphan and growing up in very difficult circumstances, she's never had the experience of wisdom and even just advice from previous generations being passed down to her. And so she's constantly faced with the dilemma of having to figure everything out on her own. And at some point she realizes that her situation is the same as everybody else's now. There is no transmission of inherited wisdom and advice coming down from generation to generation. Everybody is pretty much a feral, self-taught, self-realized person, for good or bad. It's a handicap in the sense that you have to figure out how to do things. It's a blessing in the sense that you're not limited by what you've been told on how to do things. So she can actually develop herself as sort of a freelance assassin in a way that she might not have been able to in previous environments. And in that sense, it took me a long time to come up with a character like this, my entire writing career, but she is the character that most reflects my inner life. That when she talks and reacts, she talks and reacts very close to the way I talk and react. And people who know me, my wife and my friends, say, really, when she does things in the books and she says things, I can hear you. They can hear KW talking and reacting. And so in that sense, this is a tremendous realization of how freeing it is to deal with characters that are not close to you, are not similar to you, but reflect something deep. You're seeing a common bond between yourself and a person of a very different nature. And the landscape she moves through, even though she's not limited to Los Angeles, it's very much that landscape of a person that I felt myself as a child to be, trying to figure out my position in the world. And it just worked out that way. And it was one of those things that writers are very familiar with, this phenomenon of a character coming into a writer's head fully formed and without any consideration about developing the character bit by bit. Most of the time, writers, work on sort of an accretional basis, where they bit by bit build up the character that they need for a particular story. Every once in a while, you get this sort of blessing where a character just comes into your head talking and speaking and writing, or talking and speaking and acting the way she does, and there's just no changing it. I thought, well, maybe I'm making a mistake by pursuing this character and writing stories about this character because she's so unlike me. And people will say, well, where do you get the right to talk about the world and the things that happen in it from the viewpoint of a Korean American female? And so I tried changing the character. I tried changing her from male to female, from female to male, or tried changing her ethnic background, and she just stubbornly refused to change. She just said, no, this is the way I am. You have to write about me this way. And in that sense, that's one of these things that common experience for writers, not that it happens all the time, but it does happen once in a while, where the character just appears fully formed and you have to deal with her that way.
Voilà qui m'amène directement à ma deuxième question. Vos héros, à part Kim Ho, sont bien souvent de jeunes gens ignorants, en but avec un vécu difficile, un environnement hostile, qu'ils connaissent peu. Par exemple, je pense à Dr. Adair. le père ayant disparu ou laissé un héritage lourd, comme dans Infernal Device. Alors, quelle est la place du héros dans votre œuvre? Est-il un archétype, porteur de votre propos, un témoin, autre chose?
Yeah, I think it's pretty easy to see, say, the protagonist of my first novel, Dr. Adder, as sort of being a first step on the chain of characters that very similar characters keep popping up. The person of the character who has to live and operate and act and deal with dangers and hostile environment, but without a received wisdom. Essentially, my characters are all orphans in some way. And writers tend to gravitate towards stories about orphans because, for one thing, we all tend to think of ourselves as orphans. We all tend to think of ourselves as not having received everything we need to get on in this world. And a story about an orphan very often resonates in a deep way with readers because they see themselves as orphans. But the writers themselves also see themselves as orphans. And so very many of my characters operate that way. They're in a hostile environment and they don't have the basic tools to operate, to get forward. And the conflict and the action of the story, it revolves around their just trying to find those means and feeling a certain sense of resentment that other people have these tools ready to hand and they don't. And so there's a constant sense of comparing yourself to other people. But I think this is more normal than not, that is how we deal with the world and how we feel ourselves dealing with the world. And in that sense, it's both an oppressive environment, but also a liberating environment. Whatever problems my characters have about finding their place in the world, they at least have the freedom to do so. They are not locked into it. And in that sense, these are very anarchist-like novels. They are not novels about somebody working their way up through a system. And in that sense, they're very diametrically opposed to, say, the great bulk of literature, some of which is magnificent, that deals with, in science fiction, with the military and scientific organizations. My characters would be totally lost in the military or totally lost in a scientific organization. They just can't fit in. They don't have what it takes. So none of the stories ever revolve about organizations so much as they revolve around the outsider who, if he or she has any contact with an organization, it's always sort of a hostile relationship.